Headliner Nation, welcome to Buy-mageddon. 6 teams on a bye this week and several running backs we've been using to anchor our lineup all season long. And with those guys not available for us this week, who are we going to turn to? That's why we're going to go by every single matchup this week, and I'm going to give you the analysis that you need to start making some of those lineup decisions for your running backs. But before we do that, we have to talk about our Workhorse report powered by our sponsor, BRUNT. Christian McCaffrey and Jonathan Taylor continue to lead the way with touches. Both of these guys are seeing a tremendous amount of volume. They've got a tremendous amount of upside to go along with it. Then you've got a guy like Saquon Barkley, who's still number 4 in touches so far this season, and his upside couldn't be any different than the guys listed above him. Bijan Robinson, could you imagine if this guy was number 1 in the league in touches, how many fantasy points he would have right now? And with some buys going on already, there's been a couple of guys who have made their way into the top 10 and a couple of guys who have fallen out of the top 10. Cam Scatterboo, he's made his way inside the top 10 at number 9 in total touches now. Falling out of the top 10, James Cook, who was on a bye last week. Alvin Kamara, with virtually no upside, continues to be right outside the top 10 as well. Quinshon Judkins is making his way inside the top 10. Breece Hall, Tony Pollard, J.K. Dobbins. There's a few guys right here, right now, where they're getting a decent amount of touches, but we're just not finding any ceiling with them. Jahmyr Gibbs at number 19 continues to show why he is one of the most elite running backs in terms of efficiency in all of football. Right now, after this past week, he's ranked 19th in touches, and he even compiled over 200 total yards from scrimmage in Monday Night Football. And just like these running backs who offer us a high performance in fantasy football every single week, Brunt offers us high performance workwear for any job. All-day comfort, heavy-duty durability, made for any trade that you may be in. And for our viewers right now, you can head on over to Brunt's website and use code word headliners for $10 off of your purchase. You can also try it risk-free on the job site as well. Check out Brunt today and see how they can change the way that you work. All right, 3 fewer matchups this week. We'll see how long this video ends up going for, but Thursday Night Football should end up being a good one. Minnesota at the LA Chargers, and Jordan Mason to begin the week for me has to be a start. I really like Jordan Mason this week, and one thing I'm going to do a little bit different with the start and sit videos this week is I'm going to key in on the last 4 weeks of what these teams have been doing. So far this season, I've been taking a look at the overall picture, but now I'm going to take a look at the last 4 weeks worth of trends to see if things have changed for any of these teams. And over the last 4 weeks, the Los Angeles Chargers are allowing the 8th most fantasy points per game. The last 4 games that they have played, Jonathan Taylor ran for 94 yards and 3 touchdowns. Devon Achane, 128 yards and a touchdown. JCM had 111 yards and 2 touchdowns. Cam Scatterboo, he didn't score a touchdown, but he had 79 yards on 25 carries. And as of this recording, Aaron Jones has not been activated, and there's been no word on whether or not he will actually play on Thursday Night Football. Last week, Jordan Mason ran for 57 yards and a touchdown, and now gets a matchup where that seems to be his floor. Hassan Haskins is still technically questionable as of right now. As of this recording, he's not practiced yet this week. So Kamani Vidal could end up being the only running back that we really need to worry about looking at this week. And last week was a down performance after a huge week prior to that. And a lot of people kind of got sucked into needing to play him. And I don't necessarily love him on Thursday Night Football, but given the fact that we're going to be missing a lot of running backs this week, you may not have a choice. And over the last 4 games, Minnesota has allowed some decent performances. Last week to Saquon Barkley, not a whole lot, 44 yards on 18 carries. But the week before that, Quinshon Judkins had 110 yards and 23 carries. The game before that, Kenneth Gainwell, 99 yards and 2 touchdowns. That performance kind of came out of nowhere after Jaylen Warren was ruled out prior to Sunday morning football when they were playing the international game. So when you take a look at what Kamani Vidal could do this week, I think he's got a decent floor, but given how many running backs we're going to be missing, finding himself inside the top 24 is not out of the question. Devon Achane and the Miami Dolphins right now, they are sputtering. They are on a downward spiral. No idea when their head coach is going to get fired. No idea how much longer Tua is going to end up being the quarterback. It sounds like they're not going to make any major changes anytime soon, but this is the NFL. Anything can happen at any given time. This matchup going up against Atlanta this week is the 8th fewest fantasy points over the last 4 weeks by the Atlanta Falcons. And Devon Achane, he's been a top 24 running back every single game this season. But Achane is hot right now. Over the last couple of games, he has over 200 yards rushing. And he's added a combined 11 targets as well. If we can get that type of workload this week, even if he doesn't run for over 100 yards, the hope is that he could still give us a decent performance. And given how well he's been playing, he's not even a fringe start at this point. He's going to be in your lineup no matter what. I mentioned this last week with the Atlanta Falcons, and it ended up becoming true. First and foremost, going up against the Miami Dolphins, they're currently allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game. But last week, I mentioned something that really bothered me earlier in the season with the Atlanta Falcons, and they ended up doing it again. And if you watch the end of that Atlanta game, it drove me nuts. Terrible play calling. I'm not trying to say that I could be an offensive coordinator at the NFL level or anything like that, but even a majority of us sitting there and watching that game were trying to figure out what Atlanta was doing towards the end with their play calling. Hey, everybody is right in Michael Penix's face. Let's go ahead and just drop him back 8 steps and try to throw the ball 30 yards down the field the entire time. How stupid when you have Drake London and Bijan Robinson. But it wasn't just that. I mentioned this. Back in week 2, Tyler Algier and Bijan Robinson had a huge week. Bijan had 143 yards on 22 carries. Tyler Algier had 76 yards on 16 carries. And when it felt like this backfield was going to be very comparable to maybe what the Lions do, they disappeared the next week. Bijan 72 yards on 13 carries. Tyler Algier had 4 yards on 1 carry. And they did this at times last season too, where they would pound the football, they would run it, and they would be focused on that. And then the next game it would disappear. And lo and behold, it happened a second time this season. Back in week 6 against the Buffalo Bills, Atlanta looked great and they focused on the run. Bijan 170 yards on 19 carries. He scored a touchdown as well. Tyler Algier 32 yards on 10 carries, but also found the end zone. And then last week, here we go again. Bijan 40 yards on 14 carries. Tyler Algier 16 yards on only 4 carries. Run the football, Atlanta. Please just run it. And given that this is a pretty solid matchup, I'm going to start Bijan Robinson. And for those of you that are desperate for somebody to maybe even flex, we could play Tyler Algier and keep our fingers crossed that he gets some looks and potentially scores as well. The New York Jets, they're 0-7. I still think Aaron Glenn could be the guy for this team at the head coaching position, but they're going to need some upgrades, mainly at the quarterback position. Now, that's going to be for a different video, but let's talk about Breece Hall going up against Cincinnati, who over the last 4 games of the season have allowed the most fantasy points to opposing running backs. And these are the guys that they have faced over that time. Jaylen Warren, who ran for 127 yards. Josh Jacobs, who ran for 93 and 2 touchdowns. David Montgomery, who ran for 65 yards and a touchdown. Jahmyr Gibbs ran for 54 yards. And J.K. Dobbins ran for 101 yards on only 16 carries. With as bad as the quarterback position has been, Breece Hall in this type of a matchup this week, even though he's been basically terrible for a majority of the season, I think we have to lean into Breece Hall this week, and hopefully he has a really solid RB2 floor. But one thing to keep in mind as well, for as bad as he was over the last couple of weeks, those matchups were against the Denver Broncos and the Carolina Panthers. Both of them are in the top 7 of fewest rushing yards allowed to opposing running backs. So now he's getting a great matchup. I did not love Chase Brown last week, and I'm almost certain that a majority of you out there that own him and been trying to play him, you probably didn't love Chase Brown either. This week, I really don't think we have much of a choice. He's going to have to be in our lineup. But the good news is he's coming off of his first solid performance of the season, running for 108 yards on 11 carries. Now, I hate the fact that he had 2 receptions for a -8 yards, and he only ended up finishing as an RB15 last week because he didn't score a touchdown, but it was the first time this season that he was inside the top 20. Now, the New York Jets are on the low end of fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs over the last 4 weeks, but mainly it's due to the fact that they haven't done a whole lot in the passing game against New York. Running backs right now over the last 4 weeks have the 4th fewest receiving yards against this team, and they've only scored 3 total touchdowns. So we could still see a game similar to what we saw from Chase Brown last week, where maybe he runs for 80 to 100 yards with how good this passing attack is, finally, and he has a little bit of a solid floor for the first time this season in back-to-back weeks. Cleveland and New England, and Quinshon Judkins has been fantastic since he got out of all those legal issues to begin the season. So it's been great to see him out on the field and thriving for the Cleveland Browns and putting all of that stuff behind him, even though he could potentially still have a suspension at some point in time. Moving forward with Quinshon Judkins, though, I even said a couple of weeks ago that he has top 12 potential the rest of the season. I don't think he has that in this matchup, though, but I can't even list him as a fringe start because with how well he's played, you're going to be playing him if you own him. New England over the last 4 games of the season have allowed the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and those running backs over the last 4 weeks, Tajay Spears, Tony Pollard. Nothing to write home about there, right? Spears had 22 yards on 5 carries. Pollard had 18 yards on 6 carries. Alvin Kamara hasn't been that great this season, 31 yards on 10 carries. But then you get to James Cook, who at one point in time was the RB1 on the season. Now he's fallen off a little bit the last couple of weeks, but this is kind of where his struggle started over the last 3 weeks. He went up against New England and only had 49 yards on 15 carries. And then the week before that, when the Carolina Panthers got beat 42-13, Chuba Hubbard had 10 carries for 49 yards. So really, running backs haven't had a whole lot of an opportunity, and good running backs outside of James Cook haven't had a whole lot of opportunity. So we'll see what Judkins does this week. The Cleveland Browns defense has been really good against the run all season long, and over the last 4 games, it hasn't been any different. They're currently allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points per game. But Ramondre Stevenson is going to be a fringe start for me still this week. Number one reason why has to be it's Mageddon. You may not have a choice. But over the last 4 weeks, the performances haven't been awful either. Devon Achane had 82 yards on 13 carries. Jalen Warren had 52 yards on 11 carries. The week before that, Jordan Mason had 52 yards on 13 carries and scored a touchdown. Jahmyr Gibbs lit this defense up for 91 yards and a touchdown, even though they did shut down David Montgomery. If this was a normal week with more options, then Ramondre Stevenson would probably be a sit for me. But I still think he could find a decent floor because even if he gives us the 52 like Warren did or the 52 like Mason did, and if he can find the end zone with Drake May moving the football really well right now, a touchdown and 50 yards is not the worst thing that you could get during this week of buys. The New York Giants and the Philadelphia Eagles just saw each other a couple of weeks ago, and Cam Skattebo went off. During that game against the Philadelphia Eagles, who are currently allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game over the last 4 games, a lot in part due to Cam Skattebo. He ran for 98 yards and 3 touchdowns. They also just allowed 57 yards on the ground and a touchdown to Jordan Mason. Cam Skattebo is absolutely going to be a start this week in a really solid matchup that he just dominated a couple of weeks ago. But I want to make sure that I touch on Tyrone Tracy for just a second because I think people are going to be asking about him this week and needing him to fill in for some buys. Do I think it's the worst option in the world? No, I don't. But I don't know if I want to list him as a fringe start at this point with just how well Skattebo played the last time they faced the Eagles. Plus, there was a very significant snap differential from last week as well. Cam Skattebo played 60% of the snaps, while Tyrone Tracy only played 38%. Now, Tracy actually ended up being more efficient than Cam Skattebo. Tyrone Tracy only had 9 carries last week to Skattebo's 16, but he averaged 5.1 yards per carry. Skattebo averaged 3.8. And he ended up having a touchdown as well. So for those of you wondering if Tyrone Tracy could be like an emergency flex option this week, as long as there's no other options and you're in like a deeper league where you can't find somebody on the waivers with better upside, I might be willing to sign off on it depending on the other players available. I want us to have some real talk in a very safe place right now. Is there anybody out there that feels like Saquon Barkley is way closer to being a sit than an actual start at this point? So part of me thought to myself, do we list him as a fringe start? Because he doesn't have a whole lot of top 12 potential as of recent, actually for the entire season. But then I was like, nope, can't do that, because if I put that on the slide, we'll run into an issue like we did last week, where I put one thing on the slide and then give a detailed breakdown on why it could end up being a little bit different, and nobody will actually listen to the analysis, and then I have to read comments all week long. You're not sitting Saquon Barkley. It's not happening. I'm just talking about his points being, is he worth starting or is he worth sitting? But in a week with 6 teams missing, in a league where there's a lot of running backs that don't get a lot of touches, Saquon Barkley is never actually going to be a sit. So for those of you out there with him in your lineups, you have to leave him there. You don't have a choice. The only way that you can sit Saquon Barkley is if you have 2 top 10 running backs on your team and you have multiple top 10 options at the wide receiver position that allows you to flex one if you can't put them both in your lineup. Now, over the last 4 weeks against the New York Giants, running backs are allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points per game. However, there's not a whole lot to write home about some of those running backs. Like, one was J.K. Dobbins, and he did solid, 81 yards on 14 carries. A game just a couple of weeks ago, Barkley had 58 yards on 12 carries. So we know he still has the potential to do some damage against this defense. Kendre Miller had 41 yards on 10 carries, and then Omarion Hampton had 128 yards on 12 carries and a touchdown before his injury. Now, the reason the fantasy points per game are so low is because they've only allowed 1 touchdown during that time frame. But Barkley was the RB38 last week, and he was the RB22 just a couple of weeks ago against these same Giants. He hasn't ran for over 58 rushing yards in a game since week 2. He hasn't scored a rushing touchdown in the last 3 weeks, and he only has 1 top 12 performance in his last 5 games. James Cook has been struggling, and they're coming out of the bye, so hopefully they've righted some of the things that just haven't worked over the last couple of weeks for their run game. But this isn't going to be an easy game. It's going up against Carolina, who's currently allowing the 7th fewest rushing yards over the last 4 weeks to running backs. And that's going up against guys like Breece Hall, Javonte Williams, Devon Achane, Ramondre Stevenson. We've got some solid backs in that group. And after 4 straight games to begin the season as being a top 10 running back, he has now been the RB37 and the RB18 over the last couple of weeks. Are we going to start him? Yes. Does he have as high of a ceiling as he did at the beginning of the season? Maybe not with this matchup. Good luck. I think that's all I can say when it comes to Chuba Hubbard and Rico Dowdle, because I don't know if my analysis is really going to help you decide which of these 2 guys to start. And I'm going to list them both as fringe starts. Now, over the last 4 weeks, even though they've had a bye, the Buffalo Bills are still allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. And Bijan Robinson is a big reason why that number is still extremely high. But this one is going to be tough in the aspect of who do we play and who's the guy? Because last week, Chuba Hubbard led the backfield in snaps. He had 54% of the snaps, and Rico Dowdle played 46% of the snaps. But Rico Dowdle was way more effective on the ground, running for 79 yards on 17 carries, and Hubbard was a little bit more effective in the pass game than he was on the ground. I mean, I still think it could be a solid matchup. If for some reason Buffalo just comes out and hammers Carolina early, then the run game's going to disappear, and that's going to be an issue. Andy Dalton sounds like he's going to be the starter this week for Carolina. I don't know if that helps or not at this point. Rico Dowdle, to me, is the safer option because he is showing a little bit more big playability and a little bit more efficiency right now. So even if he does see some reduced snaps compared to Hubbard, I do think he has the potential to break a bigger run every once in a while than what Hubbard does. DeAndre Swift has been the RB6 and the RB5 over the last couple of weeks, and now he gets a matchup against the Baltimore Ravens, who are allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks. Kyron Williams, when he played against them, he was RB11. Nick Chubb ended up being RB20, but we've seen how that offense has been this year. And then the Detroit Lions had the RB3, Jahmyr Gibbs, and the RB2, David Montgomery, that week. So essentially what I'm trying to say is DeAndre Swift has some pretty serious upside once again. Now, the last couple of running backs the Chicago Bears have faced have been Alvin Kamara and JCM, Ja'Cory Crosky-Merritt. And those games have not been all that great. But before the bye, the Chicago Bears gave up 138 rushing yards to Ashton Genty, who I feel like is way more comparable to Derrick Henry than what JCM or Kamara will be. And even before his bye, Derrick Henry had a solid game as well, 122 yards on 24 carries against a Rams defense that is very solid right now. And we're expected to get Lamar Jackson back this week, which could be great for Derrick Henry. If they want to control the pace of the game early against the Chicago Bears, run the football. I don't really care how tough Houston's defense is, and I don't care that they're allowing the fourth fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs over the last 4 weeks. We will start Christian McCaffrey. One thing that will be interesting to know is the matchup through the air for Christian McCaffrey, because Houston doesn't allow a ton of receiving yards. In fact, over the last 3 weeks, Houston is only averaging 7 receiving yards per game to opposing running backs. My analysis about Woody Marks is going to be very similar to what I said about Tyrone Tracy Jr., that there are a few things in play and a few concerns at play that want me looking at different running backs, that these are not the couple of guys that come first to mind. However, it doesn't mean that if you are in an emergency situation that Woody Marks and Tyrone Tracy still may not be at least decent flex options that you shouldn't expect a high ceiling from, but may get an okay floor. San Francisco is not the easiest matchup. And we've seen this with Woody Marks before, where it looked like he was going to be the guy in the number 1 running back, and then Nick Chubb still ended up being the guy the week after. And Marks had a receiving touchdown last week, which is great. But this offense as a whole is not playing well, and the running backs as a whole didn't play well last week either, especially on the ground. So once again, like Tyrone Tracy Jr., if you're in a pinch and you are desperate for somebody and you need a flex option, then you still could potentially go with Woody Marks. But I really don't think there's a whole lot of ceiling here. What about Tampa Bay at New Orleans? And we'll keep an eye on Bucky Irving once again this weekend. After the way Rachaad White and the offense played as a whole against Detroit last week, getting Bucky Irving back this week probably isn't going to be the worst thing for Tampa Bay. And honestly, I think they go right back to him, and he's the guy once again as long as he's fully healthy. But he's questionable. And it is a matchup going up against New Orleans, who has allowed the 5th fewest fantasy points per game over the last several weeks. But even though they haven't allowed a whole lot of fantasy points, they have allowed the 6th most rushing yards. So the upside may or may not be there. And if Bucky Irving misses again, I could look at Rachaad White being a fringe start, especially for his pass catching potential. But his safe floor due to pass catching work is slowly deteriorating. Emeka Egbuka is the number 1 pass catcher. But could Chris Godwin be back this week? Tez Johnson has played well in back-to-back games. Sterling Shepard had 7 catches last week. So even though Mike Evans is out, and throwing Cade Otton as well, even though Mike Evans is out, there are some pass catchers that just look like better options than Rachaad White right now. Tampa Bay is currently allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs over the last 4 weeks, but a lot of that was because of Jahmyr Gibbs on Monday Night Football. And Alvin Kamara used to play like Jahmyr Gibbs, but he doesn't anymore. There's also who's going to be next man up. Kendre Miller tore his ACL. He's done for the year. Devin Neal looks to be the next guy up, and I wouldn't be shocked if Taysom Hill gets a few more looks in the run game as well, and that made me throw up a little bit in my mouth. Alvin Kamara had a top 24 performance back in week 6, but since week 1, outside of that performance, he's been running back 29 or lower every single game. Do we have a revenge game on the horizon? There's a couple of them this week. Aaron Rodgers playing against Green Bay for the first time, and Javonte Williams going back to Denver where he started his career. Now, Javonte Williams got the short end of the stick, I believe, in Denver, and I really think he probably thinks the same thing as well. But this is not going to be an easy defense that you're just going to run out and put revenge game numbers up on right away. Over the last 4 weeks, Denver's allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, and that's with facing guys like Cam Skattebo and Tyrone Tracy, who both scored a touchdown last week. It was against Breece Hall, Saquon Barkley, and Chase Brown. Now, Hall, Barkley, and Brown, they've not been playing well in their stretch of games, so maybe we really can't look at it and say, oh yeah, Denver shut down some really good running backs, especially after last week, Tracy and Scadaboo were able to do some damage both on the ground and through the air. Javonte Williams continues to be a top 10 running back option and will be a start this week, even though it's a tougher matchup. J.K. Dobbins, on the other hand, has a much better matchup. Dallas allowing the second most fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks to opposing running backs. Now, Dobbins has run for 60 or more yards in all but 1 game this season, and he's run for 70 or more yards in all but 2 games this season. His ceiling has fallen a little bit over the last 4 weeks, though, because he only has 1 rushing touchdown during that time. But he still has at least 14 carries in all but 1 game this season, so the volume continues to be there, and this would be a great matchup to get that same amount of volume. For those of you that have been holding on to Tony Pollard and Tajay Spears to help you get through the bye, I have some serious questions about whether or not they're going to be any help this week. Over the last 4 weeks, the Indianapolis Colts have allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Now, it's been a mixed bag of running backs over that span. Vidal and Haskins last week, Michael Carter, Bam Knight the week before. We're not really writing home about any of those running backs. But Ashton Genty and Kyron Williams, the 2 games before those guys played them, they were held under 80 rushing yards, and neither of them scored a touchdown either. So while the first names don't offer you a whole lot, the last couple of names do, and to hold them down is still very respectful. And Tony Pollard and Tajay Spears are nowhere near those guys. Could you please stop that until the video is over? I'm feeling really uncomfortable right now. Yeah. You, Jonathan Taylor owners, I can see you all out there rubbing your hands together and licking your lips over this matchup. I know you're excited, and I know JT is going to have a big week this week, but I need you to stop being creepy in the middle of the video. Pittsburgh may be allowing the 10th fewest fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks to running backs, but I don't care because they just allowed 108 rushing yards on 11 carries to Chase Brown. And now they get Josh Jacobs, who has at least 2 touchdowns in each of the last 3 games. Maybe his yards are not nearly as high as we would have liked this season, but they're moving the ball and they're scoring with Josh Jacobs. This is not a great matchup for Jaylen Warren going up against Green Bay, but he has been very solid all season long. Has not had a ton of upside, but he is a guy that you can flex on a pretty regular basis, and he's even had some games where he's played well against opposing defenses that are very solid against the run. So this week, Jaylen Warren, a ton of upside? No, he doesn't. But if he could add 5, 6 targets in the passing game, catch 4, 5 of those targets, he could still have a super solid floor, and he's a flex option. I went back and forth on this one quite a bit. I had him as a fringe start, then a sit, then a fringe start, then a sit, then a fringe start. Ultimately, I decided to land on fringe start because JCM is a guy with the work that he is getting. You probably can't afford to sit with these bye weeks. But I'll tell you what, if this was a week of nothing but teams ready to go, JCM would be a sit for me. I don't love this matchup against Kansas City. It's a tough matchup. He's been terrible the last 2 weeks. Only 61 yards on 17 carries. 33 yards on 13 carries. There's a chance for negative game script here. There is a very big chance that Kansas City gets out in front of Washington, who probably will be without Jaden Daniels this week. We'll wait to hear more about that throughout the week. And if that happens, when is JCM going to get his points? He needs to get them early, and he needs to score early. And if he doesn't, it's going to be a tough night. I love that Isaiah Pacheco showed a little bit of life last week. 57 yards on 15 carries and a touchdown. And now he gets a matchup against Washington, who's allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs over the last 4 weeks. Now, if you own Isaiah Pacheco, I could definitely throw him out there as a pretty decent floor option. But I think a lot of people are going to be asking about Brashard Smith. Last week ran for 39 yards on 14 carries, and he added 5 receptions on 5 targets for 42 yards. But let's keep an eye on it. It was a 31-0 blowout. And I know Smith was still used a little bit at the beginning of the game, but as the game wore on, Brashard Smith saw more and more and more looks. So I don't know if we're in a situation yet where we can say, hey, maybe this is a flex option. But maybe also there's an opportunity for Kansas City to do something very similar to Washington this week that they did to Las Vegas last week. Headliner Nation, hopefully all of the analysis brought to you in this video is enough to help you start setting your lineups here in week 8. Crazy to think that we're almost halfway through the season already. But hopefully y'all are enjoying the content. If you do, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment down below, turn on the bell notifications, do all of those things. I've got to get going though, because I've got more start and sits to record. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.